Happy Wednesday, Mount members and friends. Welcome to the first lesson of our fall Bible study series, The Politics of Jesus. As always, we ask that you share this video on whatever platforms you can share them on, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. You can even invite others to call in 804-203-9011 to listen. If for some reason they have the Dial Pad app, they can use that as well. All right, let's get started. We're in the last 7 weeks before a critical election. Here in Virginia, in the Commonwealth, we have elections every year. But every 4 years, we have presidential elections. The presidential race is very important. But there are also some other crucial down ballot races that you've got to pay attention to, that you need to pay attention to. On the state and local level, you're going to have to make some informed decisions. Now, if you live in Richmond, Hanover, Henrico, Chesterfield, you're going to be voting for the president and the vice president. You're going to be voting for the U.S. Senate, one of the seats anyway, and you're going to be voting for your congressional representative. Most of you are going to fall in one of two categories, which is either Congressional District 4 or Congressional District 1. Those are the two congressional districts that pretty much cover our areas. Now, if you live in the city of Richmond, you have local elections on the plate as well. So you're going to be voting for the office of mayor, and there are 5 candidates. You're going to be voting for your city council representative and your school board representative in each one of the 9 districts. And so make sure you've got 50 days before the end of voting. So make sure that you go ahead and educate yourself, not just on the president, not just on the vice president, but on U.S. Senate, on your congressional seat, and on your local elections. If you're a member of Six Mount Zion, you may end up seeing some of these local candidates come through. At this point, I've not formally endorsed anybody, and so if they show up, we will recognize them or may even allow them to speak if they're running for mayor. But I need you to do your research and figure out who is best for you. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, early voting starts this Friday, September the 20th, this Friday, and continues all the way through Saturday, November the 2nd. Now, Election Day is November 5th, and so you can vote on Election Day. But in Virginia, we have early voting, so you can actually go and vote starting this Friday. Now, all of the different localities have different rules. I only can speak to Henrico. I know we have 2 places that you can go vote now, and then we pick up a 3rd place as we get closer. I know the city of Richmond has early voting locations. Some localities have Saturday voting. Some even have Sunday voting. And so you've got to find out what your locality does and vote early if you can. And so do know you can knock it out starting this week. All right? This may be preaching to the choir, but make sure that first you are a registered voter. All right? And it's easy. If you're using the computer, you can go to vote.org. Or if you're not really a computer person, then call your local election office. All right, call that office and they will tell you. But you can simply go to vote.org. I've been reading some stuff, and I know in Virginia alone, there have been thousands of people who've been expunged of their voting rights, some by mistake and other reasons that may be nefarious or not. So you need to make sure that you don't run into a snag on election day or when you're early voting. So make sure that you go and find out that you're registered. All right. And so You can find out whether or not you're registered. It will give you your voting location, and you also can register there on vote.org. All right, vote.org. Now, and we're going to be talking about this every week, giving you some kinds of updates. All right, because you also can vote early by mail. All right, you can request a ballot, and you guys know you live in America, you live in this area, so United States Postal Service has been struggling a little bit. Even the even those voter registration offices are encouraging people to come in and vote if you can, or get your ballots in super early to make sure that that your vote is counted. All right. Second thing, make sure that everybody you know in your family, in your neighborhood, that they are registered to vote as well. If you have some young people who are saying that their vote doesn't matter, you need to invite them to join this study. Just tell them on Wednesdays, I need you to take, a couple minutes to check this Bible study out, or you can tell them to call me personally so that we can talk about how important the vote is. All right. Now, if they don't have time to join us live, they can always check us out via YouTube or our Facebook link when we're done. For this Bible study series, we're going to be using the books, The Politics of Jesus, as our guide. Now, Obery Hendricks first published this book in 2007, and the description of the book reads as follows. This is almost 20-year-old description.
Who was Jesus? And how was this first-century political revolutionary, whose teachings are meant to lead the way to freedom, turned into a meek and mild servant of the status quo? How is it possible to profess a belief in Jesus, yet ignore the suffering of the poor and the needy? Just how truly faithful to the vision of Jesus are the many politicians who claim to be Christian? These are the kinds of questions Obery Hendricks, a biblical scholar, activist, and minister, asks in this provocative book.
Now, Dr. Hendricks, a professor at Columbia University in New York, begins in part 1 by detailing the roots of Jesus' political consciousness. He speaks about the political, economic, and social factors that Jesus would have had to navigate, and how Jesus the revolutionary became Jesus the meek and mild. Part 2 is where we'll focus, because he details, Hendricks that is, 7 strategies that he believed guided Jesus' ministry and politics. He notes that this list is not an exhaustive list, stating that it would be up to sincere followers of Jesus to uncover new and creative ways to unleash the power of Jesus' politics for the justice of God and for the good of all. Now, that is our challenge, and that is our call to action. I recently came across a blog which said,
instead of being marked by love, compassion, and mercy, Christians are known for the exact opposite: stinginess, intolerance, and having hearts of stone. As a Christian, I have always been political. The apoliticism of some Christians shocks me. Such a detachment from the world is not Christian. We aren't called to be out of the world, only set apart from it to be holy, different, not removed. But the thing that has disturbed me most is the politics that most Christians have. I can't reconcile those positions with the character of Jesus. Those positions judge the morality of others and withhold help from the poor and those in need. They oppress the marginalized and uplift the rich.
He goes on to say that most evangelical Christians are conservative and treat people with more liberal views like they are the enemy. They shun those who fight for social justice and the equality of the oppressed. It seems that the things that some politically conservative Christians hate are the things that Jesus actually called us to be. And the things that they stand for, we are called to avoid. So it is my duty during this series, I believe, to share what Jesus called us to be and what Jesus expects us to do. Now, what we'll be doing over the next 7 weeks is engaging in public theology. And let me share a definition of what that is and what it means for our time together. Public theology is a field that draws on biblical, historical, theological, ethical, and practical resources of the Christian faith to serve society's common good by witnessing to core values rather than seeking privilege for the Christian religion. It challenges and unsettles entrenched structures that allow systematic injustice to occur. Here are the 7 defining characteristics of public theology.
Number 1. Public theology does not seek to give preference to Christianity, but to witness to values that Christians believe are important for the common good. 2. Public theology requires the development of a language that is accessible to people inside and outside the Christian tradition. Number 3. Public theology requires an informed knowledge of public policy and issues, grasping the implications of what is at stake and subjecting this to analytical evaluation and theological critique. 4. Public theology requires doing theology in a way that is interdisciplinary in character and uses a methodology in which content and process are intertwined. Number 5. Public theology gives priority to the perspectives of victims and survivors and to the restoration of justice. It sides with the powerless against the powerful and seeks to speak truth to power. 6. Public theology requires congregations to be consciously nurtured and informed by biblical and theological reflection and a life of worship. And finally, number 7. Public theology requires a spirituality that enables a lived experience of God, with people and with creation, fed by a longing for justice and wholeness and a resistance to all that thwarts well-being.
In the simplest of terms, public theology asserts that the church should call out all injustices against all creation, and at the same time act in favor of all creation, which is what Jesus did during his life and urges those who follow him to do in their lives. We'll look at the historical Jesus, and many who may not believe him to be their Lord will acknowledge that he was indeed a leader. He was so great a leader that 2,000 years after his death, his believers are willing to suffer ostracism, imprisonment, torture, and even death to follow him. But when we search the record, we will find that the historical Jesus is different than the Jesus you may have in mind. The historical Jesus was not. The historical Jesus was not white. The historical Jesus was not American. The historical Jesus was not racist, was not homophobic, was not rich, was not hateful, was not unforgiving. And at the core, Christians, those who are followers of Jesus the Christ, are called to love others, period. Others, period. Yet conservative Christians in positions of power fight to write legalistic and pharisaical Christian moralities into the laws of our country. They attempt to enforce righteousness, all the while legislating against the poor, legislating against the defenseless, legislating and treating the marginalized with suspicion. They are quick to judge. They accuse. They refuse to give in to those who are in need. Like the Corinthians, too often, they choose to judge those outside of our Christian community instead of showing them God's love and God's mercy. Now, I'm sure you've seen it. The evangelical conservatives, some in this world that we use labels for, defined as the religious right. They're fighting to keep people in the LGBTQ community from marrying, to keep women from making decisions about what to do with their own bodies, and to treat those struggling with addiction or living in poverty as if they were criminals. They'll make excuses for white-collar tax fraud, but want to throw the book at a single mother accused of welfare fraud. Decisions are made that reinforce poverty in certain communities. They support cutting government social programs because they can afford to look after themselves and don't want to pay to look after others. In other words, they choose not to show love, not to show compassion, not to give mercy, have grace with those who need it. They choose to ignore the point of the gospel. Now, to be clear, I'm not speaking about those in specific political parties. There are some conservative Christians who identify as Democrats or Republicans or independents. And you might believe that abortion is murder, or that marriage is sacred and should only be between a man and a biologically born woman, or that people would work hard enough they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and out of poverty. Your political, personal views are important, but I don't believe that they should ever take priority over the mission of God, which is showing love, mercy, and compassion. Because no one party will tick all your boxes. It will come down to priority. As your pastor, I believe that our allegiance must be to making sure that every child has something to eat, that old folk can live their last days with security and freedom and not have to live being anxious. Our allegiance must be to working to lower infant mortality rates and to making the credit and financial systems more just, so that no one is crushed beneath the burden of debt. Our allegiance must be to crafting policies with our neighbors in mind, to listening and contemplating the people's challenges and needs with prayer and humility. This means that every pastor, every preacher, every person in the pew should begin his or her day praying, Lord, give me the loving heart to see the person's needs and to feel their hurts and to give me the strength to serve them. So this Bible study is focused on living and loving like Jesus. It's about reconciling our political views and votes with the radical love, mercy, and compassion that's expected of us as Christians. Dr. Hendricks contends that if we carefully examine the Gospels, we will find that Jesus led according to certain strategies and tactics. He did not move aimlessly, but purposefully toward a clearly defined goal. That goal was the realization of the kingdom of God. The kingdom or sovereignty of God was to be a new world order of transformed social, economic, and political relationships made holy. Now, over the next 7 weeks, and I'm telling you, these next 7 weeks are going to move fast. We will explore Jesus's teachings and deeds as political strategies. The discussion of each strategy will contain a rereading of the biblical passages in which the strategy is found. We will use Dr. Hendricks' biblical scholarship to look at the text in a different way and to talk about what they mean using contemporary examples and analogies. So here's the rundown of the 7 strategies, and then we'll get started with the first one. Strategy 1, treat the people's needs as holy. Strategy 2, give a voice to the voiceless. Strategy 3, expose the workings of oppression. Strategy 4, call a demon by name. Strategy 5, save your anger for the mistreatment of others. Strategy 6, take blows without returning them. Strategy 7, don't just explain the alternative, show it. So first up, strategy 1, treat the people's needs as holy. Our focus text comes from familiar passages of Scripture. First, we'll listen to Matthew 6th chapter, verses 9 through 13, and then Luke 11, verses 2 through 4.
This, then, is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. And forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one.
One day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him,
Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples.
He said to them,
When you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation.
We just celebrated our 157th church anniversary, where we thank God for keeping us for over 15 decades. We're grateful. But I also know that despite all the pomp and circumstance surrounding churches today, the truth is Jesus didn't found an institution. Jesus started a movement. He wasn't sent to start a religion. Jesus came to show us the unconditional love of God. Now, despite what the artwork depicts, there was no halo above Jesus' head. And if you take Isaiah's prophecy to be a description of Jesus, then he wasn't much to look at. The Voice translation puts it this way.
He didn't look like anything or anyone of consequence. He had no physical beauty to attract our attention. So he was despised and forsaken by men, this man of suffering, grief's patient friend. As if he was a person to avoid, we looked the other way. He was despised, forsaken, and we took no notice of him.
Hendricks brings this up to let us know that it wasn't Jesus' physical presence or the power of his oratory that drew people to him, because such an attraction could only last so long and would not have survived the challenges his followers eventually faced. Apparently, what drew people to Jesus and what established his credibility was his selfless service to them. When you read the Bible, you'll see that Jesus didn't ordain any deacons, didn't install any pastors, didn't consecrate any bishops, didn't have any church meetings to elect trustees. He issued no ecclesiastical degrees, wrote no complicated doctrine, established no churches, and endorsed no religious hierarchies. Jesus simply taught the men and women who followed him to put their love for God into practice by loving their neighbors as themselves. All Jesus had was a movement, plain and simple, and all who followed him in his lifetime were not only his disciples, they were also partners in that movement. Dr. Hendrick notes that it is unlikely the disciples were asking Jesus how to pray in the literal sense, because prayer was an integral part of the Jewish life. So what the disciples needed to know was what to pray for. When his disciples asked Jesus to teach them how to pray in 11:1, they were asking, what should be the focus of our conversations with God? What should we be asking God to help us accomplish? The power, the courage, and spiritual energy the disciples felt from Jesus was enough to cause them to uproot their lives and leave their kin behind with no questions asked. But now, as they're walking with him and realize that this life isn't one of luxury, they begin to develop some questions. As they listen to Jesus' ideas and his teachings in his Sermon on the Mount, they realize they are signed on to be a part of something that was totally new and something that also seemed to go against their previously unquestioned religious traditions. Jesus responded to their request with a model prayer that outlined the concerns and goals of his God-given ministry. This is how Jesus captured the allegiance of his disciples and the imagination of the people. He treated their needs as holy. Now, let's take a closer look. Now, the core meaning of both versions of the prayer is also the same. Treat your neighbors and their needs as holy. We are called to fulfill the needs of others as if we are serving God. The Lord's Prayer articulates the core principles of his ministry. And one principle I want to share before we go further is this. I want you to notice how this prayer does not lift up any personal concerns. What we call the Lord's Prayer was not meant to be an individual prayer. Private maybe, but never individual. Never for one's own need alone. In fact, there are no individual petitions anywhere in the Lord's Prayer. It's always our, always us, always we. In this way, Jesus focuses the disciples' gaze not on their own personal circumstances, but on the plight of the people. And in this season, God is calling us to do the same. Jesus begins the prayer by first telling his disciples to begin their entreaty to God, not with my Father, but with our Father, or simply Father. Jesus uses no explicitly Jewish pronouncements in the prayer, like God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nor does he use any explicitly Christian phrase, including ending it in my name or in Jesus' name. What he taught his disciples is a purposefully universal prayer. This means that those whose needs the disciples are to treat as holy can never be limited to any group, any one group in particular. Despite Jesus' very own personal relationship with God, he taught that God was the Lord and Father of everyone. Because he knew God as the Father of all humanity, Jesus ministered not only to poor Jews like himself, but to Samaritans, to the rich, to the powerful, even to the oppressive Roman centurions. Now, as we go through this lesson, ask yourself, who are the quote unquote Samaritans or centurions in your community? Who are the persons that we have a hard time seeing as a sister or brother? Next, Jesus tells his disciples in particular, to pray, hallowed be your name. Here again, Jesus reflected his Jewish ancestry and religious practice, which held that God's name is so holy that it should remain unspoken by mere humans. For every Jew, and certainly for Jesus and his disciples, God's name was already sanctified, already holy. So why would Jesus tell his disciples to pray for God to become what God already is? In a world where the Roman state religion required that Caesar's name alone be hallowed, what makes more sense is that Jesus was telling the disciples to ask God, not to become holy, but to manifest God's holiness, as in, quote, our Father in heaven, demonstrate your holiness, unquote. In the Bible, God's holiness is often coupled with God as judge. God is seen as the vanquisher of injustice. So another way to say this line is, quote, our Father of heaven, demonstrate your holiness by manifesting your judgment, unquote. Or to put it another way, our Father, we are ready for your judgment. Judgment upon what? Upon Caesar's unjust kingdom. Jesus makes this clear by instructing his disciples to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. The kingdom of which Jesus speaks is the kingdom of God. This statement acknowledges that only God is worthy of worship. No emperor, no king, no president, only God. Jesus not only preached the primacy of the kingdom or sole sovereignty of God, he demonstrated it. This is reflected by the act of teaching that Caesar's kingdom must come to an end. This was also one of the reasons he publicly rejected the legitimacy of the temple priesthood. Because rather than working to establish God's kingdom of liberation and wholeness, in too many ways, the priests were aligned with the interests of their Roman overlord, offering sacrifices on Caesar's behalf, even proclaiming, we have no king but Caesar, when their loyalty was questioned. The manifestation of God's holiness, though, the arrival of God's kingdom, the enacting of God's will, all mean the same in this particular context, that Caesar's kingdom must go. Caesar's will can no longer be allowed to rule. Jesus' total dedication to God as sovereign is also seen in his refusal to accept the kingship conferred upon him in John 6. This is a spiritual law as well as plain common sense. No two kingdoms can exist in the same space, and no two sets of laws can rule simultaneously. As Jesus tells us, no one can serve two masters. Now, this prayer calls for all people to submit to God's authority based upon God's creation of all people in all places. In a world where slavery and violence and death sentences for offenses against the state were commonplace, Jesus invited the disciples to imagine and pray for a different world in which God's sovereignty and teachings would become the values that inform all nations as they live peacefully with one another. And as his disciples living in 2024, we are called to pray the same. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Christians have used the Lord's Prayer as a model prayer for nearly 2,000 years. But during that time, many have exploited women, committed genocide of indigenous populations, enslaved people for the enrichment of others, and exterminated some groups of God's children that they deemed to be unworthy of life, all in the name of God and Jesus the Christ. Today, we have people who call themselves Christians working to disenfranchise fellow citizens with a different political view of their right to vote. They are filing frivolous lawsuits. They are vowing not to certify the election results if it is not the result they want. They are running attack ads filled with lies, throwing anything they can against the wall to see if it sticks. And months, even years before the final votes are tallied, they are already claiming that if they lose, it will be a rigged election. So, what would the world look like if God's reign were to come and God's will be done on earth? Dr. Marvin McMichael, who we've used his stuff before, answers this question by stating that the social barriers of the ancient world that resulted in so much suffering would be removed, making Galatians 3:26 through 29 a reality. Quote, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave or free, nor is there male or female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus, unquote. Jesus instructs the people to pray for God's will to be established on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus imparted to his disciples that they must strive for justice on earth as in heaven as their righteous service to God, that they must honor God by lifting up the least of these on the altar of God's justice and God's mercy, that they must set into motion a revolution of love and holistic spirituality that demonstrates love for God by treating the needs of even the least of God's children as holy. And notice, Jesus did not say in the United States. Jesus says on earth. This phrase in the Lord's Prayer is a global view of God's identity, a global view of God's agenda. During these days of hyper-nationalist sentiments in the U.S., we need to understand that God is not an American God. The United States is not God's favorite nation. God has an interest in all nations that God has made. So we serve God best when we want for other nations the same blessings of liberty, prosperity, and peace that we want for ourselves. Give us today our daily bread expresses a radical act of trust, a radical act of dependence rooted in the Old Testament story of Israel being given manna from heaven as they traveled from Egypt to the promised land. In the 16th chapter of the Old Testament book Exodus, God sent manna and quail to feed the people of Israel as they traveled through the desert to Mount Sinai. As an act of faith, the people were to gather only as much as they needed for each day. The only exception was on that day before the Sabbath, when they were allowed to gather enough for 2 days so that they could rest on the Sabbath. Those who gathered more than they needed found that the extra food rotted before they could eat it. Israel was challenged to trust God for their food on a day-by-day basis. Bread was the main food staple in Israel. Seldom was there a meal without it. On occasion after occasion, Jesus demonstrated his concern that the people have enough bread by feeding those who are hungry and by urging others to do the same. Praying for daily bread made sense in Israel in the first century because food supplies were uncertain. Between famine and locusts and attacks by rival nations that targeted their crops and flocks, daily bread was never guaranteed. Remember, praying for daily bread is not just for ourselves. We are to pray for God to be a provider to those who are unhoused, who are unemployed, who are underemployed, those who lack any form of medical insurance, and those who have no financial or food reserves. Who else would you add to this list? We are to pray for God to give us our daily bread, but then Jesus goes a step further, adding that we are to pray for the forgiveness of debts. Here we should be praying that people have the bread that they need. But we must also call for attention to the crushing debt system that was a major cause of the people's lack of bread. Jesus denounced the injustice of economic indebtedness, reminding his listeners that Caesar's callous economy is not the caring economy of God. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, release us from our debts, he used a Greek word that both means forgive and release. It is also a prayer for the end of Caesar's kingdom, because Caesar's kingdom could not stand without the imperial system that forced its subjects into debt in order to pay Rome the yearly monetary tribute. Forgiving the debts of others means decrying the exploitative ways of commerce and empire and refusing to participate in them any longer. It's a declaration to once again honor the biblical commandment not to steal, not to cheat, not to hold others hostage to debt, or even charge interest for the necessities that they need to borrow. This held the important spiritual lesson that those who follow Jesus must clear their own conscience and transform their own practice so that they can honestly declare that they themselves honor the dictates of God and not the ways of tax collectors. To pray, forgive us as we have also forgiven others, or to release debts, means we've chosen to give others the same justice, the same freedom, the same measure of life unencumbered by unjust policies that we seek to receive ourselves. When Jesus told them to pray, lead us not into temptation, that was about empire. He was not teaching his disciples to ask God not to tempt them, because God is not a tempter, as we are reminded in James 1. Reading this passage in his first century CE context is key to understanding what Jesus is saying. Remember that early Christians faced relentless persecution from the Jewish and the Roman world. First century Christians were always urged to renounce their faith in Jesus to save themselves from further persecution. The church was persecuted by Jewish religious leaders for affirming Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. The Romans persecuted the church for failing to acknowledge Caesar as a god and for failing to pledge loyalty to the Roman Empire. Christians like Stephen were stoned to death for this very reason. Rome executed Christians like Paul for failing to conform to his laws and customs. So Jesus was instructing his disciples to ask for strength to resist the temptation to serve Caesar instead of God. The temptation to give up their struggle and accept the empire as object of worship that it had made of itself, and to treat rulers' needs as holy instead of the people's. Dr. Marvin McMichael says that this interpretation is consistent with Jesus' own experiences of being tempted by Satan, when Satan tried to get Jesus to worship him and violate God's laws. So the temptation that we are called to resist is not about personal morality, even though that seems to be the focus of the contemporary church. Dr. McMichael warns about Christian nationalism, which you may have read or seen news stories about. This is the idea that God favors the United States as some type of special nation, and that the Bible, not the U.S. Constitution, should be the basis for governing America. Christian nationalists believe the wall of separation between church and state should be removed so that the church can rule the country. Christian nationalist ideology would label the vast majority of Americans as second-class citizens because of their ethnicity, their sexuality, or their religious affiliation. When the power of state is used to advance the work of any group that presumes to speak on behalf of the whole church, Christians must resist this temptation. We must defend Christianity from Christian nationalists. Lead us not into temptation is where Jesus' model prayer ends in Luke. So this is where we will stop today, but I do want to wrap up with this. Jesus taught the disciples to treat people's needs with reverence, with respect, and with compassionate care. Jesus made clear to them that using their strength and their gifts to make this a just world was the most important service that they could ever render to God. Jesus taught them to serve God by making sure that everyone had enough daily bread, that everyone was free from economic violence and exploitation, and that everyone was delivered from the grip of unjust kingdoms and principalities and powers. Jesus reminded people of what they too often seem to forget, that the best way to serve God, the best way to relate to one another, was through love. Jesus loved his neighbors as himself in both word and deed. He proved that he was with them and he was one of them. He was not a self-designated leader, nor was he placed at the people's head by those in social or political control. Jesus was simply an authentic leader because he was organically tied to the people that he served. He was recognized as their leader because he treated them and their needs as holy. The notion of treating the people and their needs as holy did not originate with Jesus. The ethical basis of Jesus's politics was based on the Hebrew biblical concepts, meaning justice, righteousness, and one that we've talked about before, hesed, which refers to love. Occurring some 240 times in the Hebrew Bible, hesed is one of the most important principles in Old Testament ethics. It has three basic meanings: love, strength, and steadfastness. So what does it mean to do hesed? That is, to treat the people and their needs as holy, as a strategy of politics. In concrete terms, it means that every political decision then must be based on what is best for the masses, on what their real needs are. The context must always be God's love and God's justice. In this strategy, what is holy must not be profane. There is no room for self-serving. Every decision and every policy must be justified by the people's actual needs and God's unfailing love for justice. So as we end today, the Lord's Prayer gives us the overarching perspective of the politics of Jesus' ministry. It is the foundation for everything else. In the weeks ahead, we will look at 6 more examples of the tactics and strategies that Jesus employed in his ongoing ministry to treat the people and their needs as holy. Jesus treated the people and their needs as holy by healing their bodies, healing their souls and their psyche. He specifically preached that the poor and hungry are blessed in God's sight, and that they and their needs are holy before God. Jesus sought to raise the people's consciousness that the political order sinned against the justice of God because it sinned against their well-being. All right, this concludes today's Bible study. I hope you share this video, and then most importantly, come back next week when we'll talk about the second political strategy that impacted Jesus' life and Jesus' ministry. As we get ready for the after Bible study chat, I want to hear your responses to any of these 3 questions. What can you do this week to treat the needs of other people as holy? Who are the Samaritans or the centurions in your community that you have had a hard time seeing as a sister or brother? Which other nations on earth are you praying that God blesses? Your answers don't have to be anything deep, but we want to be sure that we're able to come up with some practical ways to put into practice what we are learning. And before we go, I want to invite you to our after Bible study chat. You can get there 3 different ways. First of all, you can download the Dialpad Meetings app, or you can go to meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC, or you can call 804-203-9011. I want to invite you to our prayer call tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., 804-203-9011. If you're singing in the choir, rehearsal is at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, which is tomorrow, and Saturday at 10:30 a.m. And then finally, the big return of church school this Sunday at 9:30 a.m. Men, women, children. Men, women, children, and youth. All right, 9:30 a.m. And then we will worship together at 10:45. All right, let's jump over for after Bible study chat.